It's a pleasure to be here, slightly alarming. My name is Rachel Wolfe. As Peter said, my background is politics and political policy. And I thought what might be helpful today, before you hear from the other speakers, is to talk a little bit about the context and the choices that the people who are making policy are facing at the moment and how that might affect questions around electric vehicles, hydrogen, the automotive industry, net zero more generally. Before I go into my slides, I just wanted to give what, in my experience, are the different in incentives that face people who want to change policy from the outside and what the people who try to change policy from the inside face. So companies are fairly obviously, particularly in sectors like automotive, very long-term. We were just talking about this. They're very long-term, and they want to have a long-term sense of where to invest and where to move. Politicians are not. They're inherently short-term. They're facing 4 to 5 year electoral cycles and mini cycles within that. We're about to have local elections in May. They're going to make a huge difference to how political parties think of themselves, how the government thinks of itself, and how policy gets made. Companies fairly obviously like to keep as much of their money as possible. They want low taxes, they want tax breaks, they want tax credits, they want flexibility over taxes like the apprenticeship levy. Governments want to be able to spend money on political priorities, which rarely include company priorities, or at least there's not a perfect Venn diagram overlap of the two. They want to spend on the NHS, on schools, they want to spend on things that are going to make people vote for them in the next election. And companies also want public spending to reflect the priorities they face. And in questions like net zero, that's completely understandable. It's an enormous externality. It's an externality that governments and societies driving their governments have decided they have to tackle, and that creates enormous pivots across every sector and all parts of how we live our lives. Government would like to pay for as little of this as possible and certainly not make it an unbearable electoral tension in terms of how they deal with things. And I think it's always worth bearing these things in mind. There are always going to be reasonable and good tensions between what the private sector and indeed the innovation sector wants and what the government does. And that tends to drive the differences, or a lot of the differences, in policy positions. So I'm going to spend quite a lot of my time today talking about the electorate, people, because at the end of the day, that is generally what drives most large-scale policy making. And if it's not what drives large-scale policy making, that policy making tends to be relatively volatile. So to give an example, one of the only things when I was writing the manifesto in 2019 that had nothing to do with the electorate, was the promise to invest vastly more in R&D. Because it was a reflection of true personal conviction of a relatively small number of people in government. And it's something that I think is incredibly important. It is, for that reason, eternally quite vulnerable. It's very easy when you're doing things like R&D spending to pretend you're spending more than you are, to tuck things under, to do all the kinds of things that treasuries tend to do, simply because the public probably aren't going to notice. So I think when you're thinking about what is likely to change and what's not, it's worth having this lens. What are people going to notice, and therefore it's going to make it is likely to be a long-standing event, and what actually is relatively vulnerable because it's a matter of individual and government conviction. But let's go through where the electorate are and therefore where politics is right now. So number one, the only thing Peter didn't mention in his introduction, which I thought was fantastic, was the thing that is the top of every single household in the country's mind right now, which is everything's just gotten really expensive. So when we do these tracker polls, and I don't know how easily you can see it on the big screen, we do these tracker polls very regularly with my company, and if you went to, say, last September, cost of living would not have been the top on that tracker poll. It would probably have been the NHS. It might have been the economy in general. This is going up every single week and every single month, and it's going to go up further once the price cap changes imminently, and it will probably keep going up as food inflation, every other form of inflation starts to hit households. The only question in people's minds right now is, how am I going to pay my bills? And that's for good reason. And at the moment, they're seeing it mostly through energy and fuel prices, and that will continue to be the dominant way in which they see cost of living go up for the forthcoming months. We're going to start seeing huge amounts of pressure on basic public policy, not only in terms of energy policy, but in terms of spending on benefits, in terms of cushioning households, in terms of rental and housing policy, because people cannot afford to light, heat their homes, or drive their cars. That said, people still really do care about climate change. Why is it that every government has carried on with the 2050 net zero target after it was slipped in with very little debate at the end of the previous Prime Minister's tenure? It's because it's really popular. And climate change actually, despite a lot of the rhetoric around it in the media and the drive for net zero, is pretty popular with everyone. It may be slightly more popular with what we call AB professionals, people with more money, but actually across demographics and age groups, people do think that we need to tackle climate change and head to net zero. And that has remained the case, even though cost of living is going up enormously. So why do politicians talk about net zero policy? Why do they like to announce it? Partly because they believe in it themselves, partly because they want to project, and this was certainly true during the year when we were hosting COP, partly because they want to project a serious leadership role, but it's also because they know that the public care about it, and particular demographics in the public, the young being the most obvious, care about it deeply. They care about it less than cost of living, but they do care about it. So while at the moment there is burgeoning and increasing pressure from the right, for those of you who don't recognise it, this is Nigel Farage's new logo for his net zero referendum campaign. There is increasing pressure from the right to move away from net zero, to cut green tariffs off electricity bills, although that is easier said than done since most of them are contracts, to double down on shale and fracking and move back to coal. Actually, that political pressure is not reflected in public opinion, which is one of the reasons, not the only reason, why you will have seen Kwasi Kwarteng and Boris Johnson saying that the route away from of our security challenges, our energy security challenges, is through increasing provision from renewables. That said, I think one of the huge debates that is going to happen in policy and politics for most of this year and into next year, and will unquestionably have an impact on how much money there is available for anything else, and how policy on future technologies is seen, particularly where there are huge infrastructure requirements, like, for example, hydrogen heating, is going to be who pays. And there is going to be increasing scrutiny and understanding from the public that they are paying for some of this through their energy bills, and there's going to be increasing pressure in terms of prioritisation of public finances. Because those finances are in really big trouble. And there is one thing that still tends to unite the right as opposed to the left, for want of a better term, and that is a belief that they need to demonstrate economic competence and a degree of fiscal discipline if they have any hope of winning the next election. I'm not completely convinced by that analysis, but it is very, very widely shared. And the Chancellor made very clear in his speech in February that he was only willing to cut taxes, which is the thing he most wanted to do, if he thought that the public finances could stand it. They do not want to go into the next election looking like they have uncontrolled borrowing, which is really challenging because everyone's asking them to spend lots of money on households right now. And the reason I think this matters is that we are heading for a very, very nervous Treasury who is going to be deeply reluctant to commit to more public spending, even on its pre-announced priorities unless it is on reducing cost of living, potentially through taxation. And I think that's a reality that as you think about the long-term investment that you want, we all have to recognise. It's not very obvious where the growth is going to come from. And I think one of the missing pieces in the debate, and I'll come into where I think the opportunities are in a minute, is how industries are going to increase economic growth and productivity, ideally outside London and the southeast, but right now at all. It's not at all obvious, if you're sitting in the centre of government right now, where the growth is going to come from. And meanwhile, I don't know if you've all seen this, it's a great website. It's a ticker. It's just the European Union, but we sort of reflect it, of how much money we have sent to Russia for fossil fuels since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. I took this yesterday as a screenshot, so it will have gone up substantially since then. But if the first debate is cost of living, the second debate in energy and net zero right now is how we reduce energy dependence. You'll all be familiar with these numbers. While it is true that we don't take a lot of gas from Russia, we do take a reasonable amount of energy from Russia, and the big debate within the Conservative Party right now is where you get the alternative energy sources from. And all of this is consuming everybody's time and energy. The thing that was striking during the COVID period was that actually net zero was probably the only area of proactive policy announcements outside of COVID. Nothing else really happened. I can't think of an education or a health or a welfare significant announcement during COVID. Most of the government's bandwidth was taken up with coping with the pandemic, with the exception of net zero, where we actually saw a staggering amount of policy, and I'll come on to that in a minute, most of which was driven by, again, personal conviction, but also the fact that there was this huge international event, COP, that everyone wanted to go well, and a belief that the government's international standing, its position as global Britain after Brexit, was going to be massively enhanced by showing leadership on climate change. Now, the personal conviction hasn't gone away, but right now what everyone's worried about is Russia and Ukraine, and that's taking up a huge proportion of government bandwidth. And what is not taken up by that is how to deal with cost of living. And I think the result of that is twofold. The first is, I would be astonished if we saw large amounts of major new net zero policy this year. I think it would be really, really surprising, because I don't think the bandwidth exists to do it. The second is that the extent to which there is what I would call second-tier policy, which is what actually probably most of you are most interested in talking about, what do we do on specific, really important things, is going to be entirely down to whether the individual Secretary of State is competent or not, and whether they have ideas or not. So we've lost a huge proportion of central direction of policy making, and that's where actually most of net zero policy was originally coming from. It was very much driven by Downing Street, sometimes with more or less unwilling help from the Treasury, usually fairly unwilling. Now it's all going to be down to whether the Department for Transport or BEIS cares, because they don't have the time to think about it otherwise. So I think I've already gone through this. Basically, net zero policy is going to be sources of energy and cost. The other final thing I wanted to talk about briefly was, because one of the questions I was asked before I prepared this was, where is the new policy coming from? From the government's point of view, and I'm not saying that the government is right about this, they've already produced quite a lot of policy, thank you. Some might think that they have produced an excessive number of policies and strategies, not all of which agree with each other. Others, such as in hydrogen, might think that the thing called strategy doesn't necessarily deserve to bear the name. But from the government's point of view, particularly when we look at its broad net zero strategy, the heat and building strategy, and a lot of what it has decided in terms of mandates and incentives on electric vehicles, it's kind of done with its big policy making, and it's now about delivery. So I think if you are looking for major new policy changes, I think it is an uphill struggle. On the other hand, and governments vary in how self-aware they are about this, but quite a lot of parts of governments are self-aware about this. They're not that great at delivery. So this is the area where help from outside actually tends to be very helpful and most impactful, right? They're now past the big political decisions outside cost and sources, and where they are desperately going to need help is how you make any of this stuff work on the ground. There are, of course, going to be some new tensions, however. I've talked about some of these already, but to talk about a few more. There are inevitably going to be major policy tensions beyond the basic question of source about what the position is on, for example, how we create hydrogen, and what we think about fossil fuels with that, about what we think about intermittency and how we're going to manage that if we are really doubling down on renewables as and trying to speed that up further as our route out of dependency on other countries. There is going to be a renewed question with cost of living on, for example, home decarbonisation, because people can't afford upfront insulation costs, they can't afford upfront heat pump costs, particularly with the associated costs that come with it, and people are about to get poorer, not richer. And this adds to the already pre-existing question, which I'm sure you all spend lots of time thinking about, which is the government's going to need to replace the revenue from fuel duty, and at the moment its only idea is road pricing, which I'm fairly willing to bet is not the most popular policy to go into an election with. And as I said before, fiscal discipline matters a lot to them. So cost of living and sources are going to raise some new interesting policy questions that I think the industry needs to get ahead of in terms of what it thinks the answers are. And on delivery, I think as Pete said, electric vehicles are really popular. People love electric vehicles. When you poll them and when you do focus groups with them, people are buying them. But it is not obvious that the government is getting quite as fast on some of the delivery challenges that certainly from our research and others have prevented people making purchases, particularly in some parts of the country, as they need to. When we've done mapping on different parts of the country in terms of, for example, charging density, it's a massive, massive, massive variability, and it does come up frequently in terms of barriers to behaviour change, even in electric vehicles, which across all the different things that we need people to change their behaviour on is, I would say, by some margin, the most popular. That said, having said policy won't change, they have no money, and unless it's delivery, you're in trouble, I think there is some things to bear in mind going back to electoral priorities and electoral politics. This government has staked, and both political parties are going to do this in the next election, has staked its reputation and success on what it broadly calls levelling up. And what it needs to be able to do for a vast swathe of constituencies outside its traditional battleground at the next election is persuade them that voting Conservative for the first time was worthwhile. And if you're the Labour Party, you need to persuade them that voting Conservative for the first time was a total waste of their time and they should come back to Labour forever. There are a number of things that means, but one of them it unquestionably means is jobs. The first two quotes at the top there are from focus groups we did for SMMT last year of people who worked in the automotive industry. And the quotes from here all are from the modelling that we did for that report. The basic point is this sector and industry represents one of the few large-scale jobs that people are deeply proud of, feel are stable, offer progression and stability for their families, and are precisely the kinds of jobs that they would like to see more of and are terrified of seeing less of in the future. And they align geographically to an enormous extent to the areas that are most politically important. So if you want to see policy change in a broad sense over the next few years, the link between that and job creation, or at least not job loss, is going to be the single most important argument that you can make. And the other thing, of course, as I've said, is that despite all of these headaches and despite the fact that people are very worried about cost, they really want these changes. And they don't just want them from the point of view of net zero. They would really like more regular buses that do not produce air pollution. Air quality comes up really frequently when we do general levelling up focus groups. People get a little bit confused about the difference between air quality and net zero and greenhouse gas emissions, but broadly they lump it all together in terms of a better environment and a better environment for their children. And so there is a real desire to see change. So I'm going to sum up very, very quickly. The government thinks it's done with big policy, and the only big policy it's going to make is to try and reduce people's bills or remove dependency on sources. But I think there is still a huge opportunity for the industry to support delivery, which leaves a lot of policy questions unchanged, and remind the government that if they want jobs in new levelling up areas, getting this transition right is probably the route to do it. Thank you.